on Mars? How often do you get to do that? Which is really, really fun to do.
I was very excited because this is stuff that we love doing.
It ended up looking pretty cool. We were very proud of that one.
Just making sure that we're giving that all the thought we can to kind of deliver the best performance.
Hello, and welcome to our panel on big effects for the small screen featuring destruction effects in the Amazon Prime series, The Expanse. My name is Kelly Singh, and I am the moderator for today's discussion. First and foremost, thank you to SparkFX for hosting today's panel. We can't wait to travel back in time through 5 explosive seasons of such an incredible show, and especially one that is so near and dear to us. Joining me today, I have the awesome crew from SpinVFX who brought the story to life and then, of course, blew it all up. They are Visual Effects Supervisor Paul de Oliveira, Visual Effects Supervisor Kyle Menzies, Creative Director Bert Poole, CG Supervisor Masa Gorban-Karimi, CG Supervisor Mark Krentz, and FX Supervisor Tim Sibley. Hi, guys. Now, obviously, with 5 seasons behind us, there is so much to talk about. So we're going to pick a few of our favorite shots from every season, starting, of course, with the first one. The thing that stands out in season 1 is the sense of mounting dread that really sets the tone for the series in an important way. And the stylistic choices in the effects really confirm that unsettling feeling. Taking a look at one of our freakier shots from that time, Tim, how did you approach designing the creepy, undulating look of that red matter and the tentacles in a way that really helped to match the theme of the episode?
So we had looked at all sorts of reference for fractals and coral structures and slime mold and you name it. Like it was, we kind of wore out Google looking for cool material, but eventually we kind of settled on the look and some concepts. And then in terms of bringing it to life, we wanted to make sure that it felt organic but organized. Like we couldn't push too far in either direction. Like it had to feel like there was logic behind it, but at the same time we wanted it to be scary and feel like it was really growing and threatening the ship. So for me, when we took it on an effects, it started out as a sculpted VDB volume that grew directly off of our engine room asset. We meshed it, we created all sorts of masks and noise patterns that brought it to life. There were some areas of it that were kind of blooming dynamically. We integrated our blue bioluminescence look, which in that sequence is really the kind of the coolest part of it, just because it's a really dimly lit sequence, but there's all these little interactive lights that are flashing all over the place. Part of that was also the little fireflies that we have erupting procedurally from little parts of the surface, which I think really kind of tied it together. The shallow depth of field in some of the shots made those look really, really pretty with some of the bokeh artifacts and all the nice little touches that Comp threw in. And one thing that if you look through all of those shots, it's harder to see in some of the wide shots, but in our close-up, you see the character struggling to get out of there. That stuff was fun because we wanted to tell the story that this thing had taken over the crew and they were embedded in this, or they were being recreated by the proto-matter. So in that close-up in particular, we had animation do just a beautiful pass of this crew member struggling. And then I kind of absorbed that into the overall volume, meshed it all together, added these little tendrils and things poking out of it. And the end result was pretty creepy.
Well, as Tim explained, majority of the work was done in effects department in Houdini with creating all these volumes and all these amazing shapes and organic veins and tendrils and fireflies and all of those they brought in to Katana. And in Katana, all those things needed to be lit to match to the environment that those character and all those protomolecule objects are. Yet still have all those glowing components of the protomolecule. And all of those glowing components actually came from Tim's department. They rendered a lot of different RGB mats, variation of the mats, 4 different components of the character, the tendrils, the fireflies, and then all of those in combination with the renders that lighting department did, they all went into Nuke, our compositing tool, and then they could use all of those individual mats to kind of glow and enhance the look of the protomolecule, all that beautiful blue glow and all of that on top of what was actually rendered out of lighting.
Season 2 featured a lot of cool destruction work, but one of the major moments in the season was the Mars battle test sequence. Kyle, I'm wondering if you could give us an overview of that sequence and what it took to create it.
Great way to start this second season. We were introducing a new character, Bobby Draper, who's one of the main characters in the novels, and she's a Martian. Humanity has branched off, and there's a group of humans that have colonized Mars and are terraforming it. So we had two kind of major components to it. One was Bobby Draper's battle armor. It was basically an Iron Man suit. It was actually built by the same company who created the Iron Man suit. And so there was a practical version of the suit, and we had to create the digital version for wide shots and some of the more heavier action shots. And then the second part was just fleshing out the world, what Mars looked like. So we had a lot of research on Mars, and I think that was at the time not too far after some really great imagery was coming back from one of the probes from NASA. So we did a lot of looking at those images. The process of terraforming the planet was well underway, so we had to create these large terraforming towers. The visual effects were mostly done through digital matte painting and some projection work. And of course, Tim's department did a lot of great effects, explosions and destruction work in that sequence.
We wanted to make sure that it felt not kind of like a sci-fi explosion, but like something that could have been an on-set pyrotechnic. We wanted it to feel, grounded and scary and dangerous and all those good things. So we went with less of kind of the Hollywood fireball look and more of kind of a dirty look with little sparks going everywhere and little bits of rocks that were contaminating the frame, just to try to make it feel kind of as visceral as we could. So we got match moves from animation for some of those because we actually were placing these things so close that they could never have done it on set. It was right beside the actors in some of these cases, and I think part of that was to show off the special Martian suits that they were wearing, which was protecting them from these things. And in terms of actually executing them, we did all of the work in Houdini. So for most of those, we would start off with kind of a parent sim of a particle system that would have the general direction for where these things were going. That would emit a high resolution point cloud for dust and then some extra points for instancing rock debris. We'd use that same element to advect a pyro fire burst that would come out of there at the right moment. And when all of those elements came together in comp, it ended up as a fairly successful effect, hopefully.
At the time when this was done, I was at the production, helping. I was doing temps for the production for Expanse, and I got to work with the director, Brett Eisner, on the temps for this sequence. When I did do this, I was comping for like over 15 years, and you get to a point where you're like, oh, okay, I've done everything. There's nothing that's gonna, surprise me. But of course, people running on Mars, how often do you get to do that? Which is really, really fun to do. There was the sequence or the shots where Bobby was running, and there's a really high shot of a turret going in it, and it shoots down towards Bobby Draper as she ducks. I can tell that the comp team was going to have fun with that one because that was digi-double from high up above, and they had to morph, or they had to do some, follow the bullet down to her as she crouched and then morph into the plate. So I knew that was going to be a bit of a challenge. Yeah, it was a lot of cleanup, a lot of fun comping to do for that whole sequence.
So Mark, creating an environment to bring together practical plate elements requires a lot of creative integration. Can you tell us about how matte painting plays a unique role in bringing an environment to final?
I mean, of course, you have to evaluate the shot and know exactly what we're looking at, and in particular, the camera track. How much parallax is going to be on this camera, and if we can get away with a lot of DMP solution. It is fun to build things digitally, but under how fast VFX goes, usually matte painting is where we want to try to get the biggest bang for the buck in the quickest amount of time. But I mean, the matte painting department at Spin is not just 2D. We're also integrating a lot of 3D elements in that department as well. And actually, Expanse was one of the shows where we started to investigate that a little bit further by getting that department up to speed with some of the DCC programs where you can create really quick terrains, and then they can use that as an aid for their matte paintings, whether they're just projecting something onto some rough geometry or they just need to figure out perspective of something in a shot. We initially started doing an environment build of a lot of these Martian environments. We passed that to DMP to use if they wanted to for a lot of their shots. But what's been fantastic is, again, they've been able to handle a lot of that themselves. The matte painting has saved us a ton, and just because of how big these shots were, that they can just knock out a background really, really quick, integrate, and then Con can integrate that into the plate. It worked out well for most of our massive Mars environments.
And if the battle sequence wasn't enough, we also had that amazing Venus impact shot in season 2, which is now one of a few planet impact shots that we've done for the show, but at the time it was pretty unique. For multiple seasons, this team has had to animate rockets, ships, asteroids, all of them in outer space. And Bert and Mark, I'm wondering if you guys could weigh in here. What are some of the unique challenges that you've faced, and how does the performance of asteroids in previous seasons compare to later seasons? Because I know we had a lot of that in season 5.
Yeah, so with respect to asteroids in season 5, obviously they were a main part, as Marcos Soneros had launched them at Earth as weapons. We knew that we were going to have a lot of shots. We were up close on these. That part of the problem with the Expanse, or one of the difficulties of the Expanse, is we're trying to keep everything authentic and work in these absolutely insane scales, which means covering millions and millions of miles in a given shot. And when you're simply looking at something from afar, animating over that distance, it's not a big deal. But the problem is we're riding on these asteroids, so we're trying to cover millions of miles while looking at centimeters of data and having fine details displaced, while also asking the computer to then also move it over huge distances, and you get into these rounding errors, and the software starts to break down, and that's where we end up having to come up with some really creative solutions to maintain they're extremely painful shots, because we end up having to maintain that render integrity of the surface without it flipping out, without just these little pops and bubbles occurring because of just little rounding errors on these gigantic numbers. While also covering the distances that they desired, maintaining that integrity of the space. The other thing is we're also trying to accommodate effects. We're trying to work with those speeds and have authentic feeling forces that are applied to their asteroids and to these effects that they're doing, like when the railgun's blasted apart or whatever. We want to try to make it as physical as possible. There's just a lot of hurdles that you have to deal with. Those shots are just really, really painful to execute.
What I found to be challenging, and maybe Bert could speak more to it, but is actually just trying to set up the cameras and trying to come up with something compositionally pleasing for these huge shots where you just have an asteroid and maybe a planet in the background, but how to create a shot that was interesting with just those elements in your shot. And I know there was a lot of back and forth, to try to get something that was dynamic and exciting and still tells the story. But that was another big hurdle for us, was just trying to get some dynamic camera work out of it. And as you know, with Expanse, there's a lot of fantastic camera work that they've come up with to do a lot of these solves. But for me, I think that was one of the hardest things. And then also even lighting, like you're in space. There's not much out there other than maybe one directional light, and you have a star field. So you're also trying to give some drama to these shots in space with a limited lighting as well. There were a lot of things that were.
I can add to that. The camera difficulty is that a a lot of the shots are very long shots. Like they're trying to tell a lot of story and convey a lot of drama as an event is playing out. This asteroid is hurtling towards Earth. And so maintaining, when you have a single object in relation to a camera, and then your next nearest object is millions and millions of miles away, actually creating any sense of speed is really tricky. You end up having to, you want to pan the camera, you want to throw in a Dutch with a little bit of a roll to it, just to get some movement and create some movement. But there's only so long that you can pan. There's only so long that you can do things to create that dynamism. And so I think that's where a lot of the struggle is. So we took some of the great camera work from past seasons, especially where the guy's hurtling through space and hurling himself around the orbits of other planets to pick up speed. There was some really great inventive work done there to create those shots. And so we were taking a lot of cues and looking at past work that the Expanse had done to leverage that to tell the story of these asteroids and create these dynamic moves. Those were things we had to be very mindful of. It's something that the Expanse crew is very good about keeping us honest to, and just making sure that we're giving that all the thought we can to kind of deliver the best performance.
Yeah, they're absolutely right. Like the speeds and distances involved in this are just sort of completely out of whack with what we're used to dealing with on more earthbound productions. So yeah, either you apply a little bit of artistic license to it, but because it's Expanse, you have to kind of stay true to the science. So with the Venus one, we know what Venus looks like. So I started out just looking over all the high-res Venus material we could find, trying to get the color, the pattern for the clouds. And Venus as a planet has this really, really thick layer of atmosphere. So normally with a shot like this, we would have went straight to DMP and maybe projected something, but because we had this asteroid impacting so fast, I knew we were going to have to, do all sorts of cool dynamic things to the atmosphere and have it separate, have the shock wave propagate through it. So I ended up modeling the layers of atmosphere individually as volumes in Houdini, and trying my best to match the color palette and some of the sort of turbulent features that you'd see in those clouds. I did my best to mix some types of noise together. I didn't want the kind of Photoshop 5 default noise effect on the clouds, because everybody sees that and it looks like fake noise. So I tried to mix different frequencies. For anybody that's done this before, I tried to disturb the world space coordinates heading into the noise so that the noise itself had sort of a layer of noise one generation higher than it, if that makes sense, just to make it feel organic and like something that you'd really see on a planet like this with all those storms going on. So once we were happy with that look, then we threw a rock at it. That came from animation. And the biggest thing was the shock waves. So we turned the volumes into a live sim, had a radial force that pushed out, and it meant that we were collecting this cloud material on the leading edge of it, which was a pretty cool effect. And then right at the center, we did an additional hero sim where you get these little cloud structures that really, really quickly form to kind of sell the speed of this. So you get a really quick bang, these things form, they slow right down because of the scales involved here. And we decided for that one that we couldn't really read any traditional fireball features because we were so far away and on a planetary scale. So we told the story with a really, really bright light source in the center, but then was casting volumetric shadows through all of these layers of dust elements, which ended up looking pretty cool. And compositing, of course, is an effects artist's best friend, so they brought the best out of it in the end.
Now, Kyle, we would be remiss if we did not take this moment to acknowledge your hilarious background, which is, of course, the subject of my next question and one of the coolest parts of the show in general, and that is the proto-hybrid creature. Obviously, the destruction of the hybrid character is one of the most iconic moments in the season. Can you talk a little bit about that character and how we approached this particular shot?
Basically, the character is a hybrid. This is the evil Protogen Corporation's creation. They've combined human DNA and a literal human being with the protomolecule to create a weapon. Spin was lucky enough to get tasked with that to create the hybrid, proto-hybrid. We'd originally done some tests, some walk cycles and stuff with the model that we built as a test, as a proof of concept to show that we could do it. And the filmmakers liked what they saw, so we then went into a design process for the creature, sculpted in ZBrush. Tim's department, again, we had to blow this creature into basically atoms. There was a story point that the guy had to be completely obliterated. There couldn't be a molecule left because, you know, it was a plot point that there couldn't be protomolecule floating around in the universe. So it was a big sim, I think, in the effects department to create this destruction down to a molecular level.
So jumping forward now into season 3, we're going to look now at this amazing spaceship explosion that is definitely one of the cool explosions that we did for that season, and one of many that we've done for the series overall. And Masa, I'm going to turn to you. You know, the guys have already talked a little bit about the challenges of lighting something in space, but I'd like to get into more detail. How do you handle it when you're dealing with just one single source of light, which you often are in an outer space environment? Do you need to cheat reality to be able to tell the story to the viewer?
To some degree, yes, because as you know, there's no atmosphere in space. So when there is the sun hit the spaceship, and then the rest of the spaceship, which is in the shadow, supposed to be completely black. And that doesn't make for a very pretty shot. So for sure, we need to see all the details of the spaceship, even though it's in shadows, to make for a dramatic, beautiful shot. So we normally cheat that. Among ourselves, we say, let's imagine there are a bunch of moons around and they're bouncing some lights back into the shadow parts of the spaceship. We have amazing HDRIs that we use to cheat that of the Milky Way or other outer spaces HDRIs that help us to create that a slight little specularity hits and detail that we can see in the shadow parts. Still, we keep them quite dark, so it's not too much of a cheat, but enough to see that the whole beauty and the greatness of the spaceship. But in this majority of the shots, when the spaceship is exploding, the dramatic part comes from the explosion, and that's when it becomes really fun. When Tim and his team create the explosion, they export the fiery parts of the explosion as a geometry, and that normally goes into Katana, our lighting tool, and the lighting artist will turn that geometry into a geolight and then render the spaceship with that. And because that geometry timing is matching to the timing of the explosion, that interactive lighting on the spaceship matches exactly to the explosion, which makes for a really great dramatic moment.
Then next up, we have the missile impact shot, which in my opinion, despite the destruction, is one of the prettiest shots that we've done for the show. Tim, how does this impact shot compare to what we did in the Venus impact shot in season 2?
Yeah, they were similar. The biggest difference, obviously, is one is sort of a ballistic collision where it's just a rock hitting the surface at a very high rate of speed. This one was meant to be a weapon, so there is the explosion element to it, but construction-wise, they were somewhat similar. The best thing I think we had going for us with this shot was just before we even started, the design of it was great. We had this sort of sunset rim lighting off in the top right corner, which meant that most of the frame was filled with this kind of twilight blue-purple light. And then we had our interactive fire pyro light that's adding this warm tone back into it. So right off the start, it was going to be hard for us to screw up because it just, like, the color palette and everything was really, really pretty. So the first step was to recreate the cloud atmosphere. So we had a clean DMP projection of the Earth's surface. We redid the cloud layer matching to some satellite reference that we'd found. We isolated a hero area of our CG cloud volume to make the active area. So when the bomb went off, we could turn that into an active sim, have the shockwave propagate through it. It wasn't quite as forceful in the case of this one, but it was more dispersing the clouds a little bit while keeping some of them there and pushing them. So we wanted to not go too far with it where it would start to break the scale of it. And then with the kind of mushroom cloud itself, that was a very high-res pyrosim we did in Houdini. We wanted to push it more to kind of the pyroclastic volcano kind of style look for it. So we rendered the smoke at a really high density and had some really nice internal volume lighting that were sort of cascading onto the surrounding volume elements, and it ended up looking pretty cool. We were very proud of that one.
That's amazing. So actually, another great part of season 3 is a big shock moment, and that was the full body explosion that we did for the character Mineo. For our viewers, this is not a good one to follow if you've got a squeamish tummy. Skip this part if you don't like blood and gore, because it is definitely one of the goriest ones that we've done for the show. And Mark, I'm going to come to you. This was actually shot with a practical puppet designed with the aftermath of the exploded torso. How important is the preparation of the digidouble for the match move to allow the FX takeover to produce such a realistic splatter?
I was very excited because this is stuff that we love doing, and we actually have a model in-house that we use for a lot of our productions. And when we create a digidouble that gets torn apart in this way, we're ready for this because we have all the innards and every organ you can possibly think of inside this model that we create for these digidoubles. So when Kyle was presenting this and he was showing us this shot, and I'm going, this is gonna be awesome. It's gonna be so much fun. And so I remember talking to Tim about this, and Tim was like, I think we could really get away with a pretty quick solution here, where we simplified it because of the quick shot, where we just kind of mocked up Mineo's head, and then we're going, well, do we need more than this? He's like, well, I think I can just do a projection. I could probably take the plate, project Mineo's head onto that geo, and then we can add all the inner bits in that to just explode outwards in those few frames. And I think we provided Tim what he needed, but after it went through effects for that first test, I think Kyle's like, yeah, I think that'll work. And so, all right, well, I guess, we kind of washed our hands clean in the assets department, and most of that effect came from Tim and crew.
So jumping forward into season 4, we have to talk about the tiller. The tiller sequence was an enormous, stunning moment that really stands out from the rest of the series in such a cool way. Paul, as our VFX supervisor of that season, can you explain this shot and how you and the team approached it?
The tiller was on Ilus, and the good thing about this planet is that Ilus was so similar to Earth that we didn't have to worry about different types of gravities or anything like that, or anything that differentiated all of the elements involved to react differently than what we're accustomed to. The tiller itself was this really cool machine that devastated 2-kilometer diameter and anything in its path. So we were given a concept of just the top of it. And we knew what would happen around it, but we had to figure out what kind of machine to build underneath to have this round destruction. So for something that is, of course, 2 kilometers wide, we have to figure out the thickness of each blade and the teeth that, cutting into the ground so that the effects team can work properly with this round being crumbled up and being thrown into the air. We did actually shoot this in Uxbridge, Ontario. We used the drone to fly over and give us textures for the dunes. We tried going really high, but then we wouldn't get all the nice details of us just skimming the surface of the ground. So we went pretty low. We were only about 5 feet off the ground. And because we were traveling, pretty fast, it looked like, at a grander scale, it would appear to be, something that is 500 feet. And so we just did a bit of a cleanup on the grass blades, handed it over to the CG department. They cleaned it up, and then we projected our textures over top, and that was it.
We had a really specific look that this sequence had, and so in that one particular shot, which was the challenging shot of the sequence when camera was moving a very, very long distance and quite rapidly over the terrain. So that terrain we had to create to match to the look of the rest of the sequence, which needed to be quite large. Then we used a lot of the texture information that we got from the drone footage, as Paul described, but that wasn't enough. So we had to cover the whole ground with a lot of other procedural or hand-painted materials, textures as well, and materials to just for a large terrain like that, to create enough varieties for it to not look flat and look still interesting. The lighting did a great job on that to just with gobo dabbling lights and nice HDRIs to just again make sure that the ground doesn't look really just large and flat, because even though the lighting had to match to the day that they shot the footage on, which was quite overcast, but even in an overcast situation, we still have in nature, we have parts that are darker and parts that are brighter. So we had to create that in lighting for that whole environment. And then we rendered that. And then on top of that, we did big amounts of matte painting to create the last level of photorealism and all the nice little detail of the river formations and everything that got matte painted and then got projected onto the geometry on top of the lit version of the ground. But of course, the most important part of the shot was the tiller itself and the destruction which was happening, which all was done in Houdini. Tiller itself was a really, really big machine, as Paul mentioned, a very, very cool machine to light and render by itself. But all of the destruction was happening in Houdini, in our effects department and Tim. All of that, we wanted to render that in Houdini, so we had to create the same exact lighting situation that we had for the ground plane in Katana, replicate that exactly in Houdini, and then render all the ground being destructed and all the debris and dust and all of that.
We really didn't want to shortchange the audience with this one, just because we'd established how massive these things are. Like, these are bigger than skyscrapers. They're absolutely enormous, and just on a scale where we haven't really seen stuff like this before. So we knew it had to be something special. So in a sequence like this, so we did our first tests using real world values for gravity, which were interesting, but we had to tweak those just because it ended up feeling a little bit too slow, a little kind of goofy with the tiller moving as fast as it did. And that was really one where we took the real world values and then we applied the eye test to it and found the values that actually ended up feeling massive with as little cheating as possible. So for the ground itself, we took that beautifully prepared geometry and we smashed it into bits. So we did multiple layers of fractures of the ground geometry. Those then got fed into a bullet RBD system in Houdini. The tiller was our collision object for that. We simulated some extra forces along with that to move all these pieces. And then I think the most important thing was the dust that came out of these events, because it was kind of a dry desert landscape, and the dust not only helped to bring the active areas to life, but it also gave a sense of history for the path that the tiller had taken. So for some of those shots, we had to pre-roll almost 1,000 frames of dust sim to establish the dust cloud that was hanging in the air. And that then got married with some of the foreground elements that were a little bit more active. And the only other thing we had to really deal with was the amount of geometry that we were trying to render at that point with all those fractured bits. So we ended up keeping the geometry fairly simple on the pieces, and then at render time in Mantra, we did a custom shader that was adding displacement to the interior faces, which let our detail level go up quite a bit without destroying our memory footprint.
Also in season 4, we would be completely remiss if we did not stop to talk about that amazing, iconic tsunami scene in season 4. If you have not seen it and you're watching this panel right now, as soon as we're done, definitely go check that out, because it was an incredible sequence and very ambitious for a TV show. Paul, can you explain the theme and intention of the tsunami scene? How did the look of the environment set the tone for this episode?
Thank you. For this tsunami, it was so important for us to get it right, because it's a huge part of the show. In the story itself, there's this on Illis, there's this island that explodes on the opposite side of where the characters are. So in this, like, I don't know, kilobajoules, I don't know how to say it, but it's that many megatons of nuclear explosion. And they have about 8 to 10 hours to evacuate their camp. So to get out of there, they have to find a safe place to hide. So they go into one of the ruins, and they barricade themselves in there and wait for this impact to arrive. And there's this really cool shockwave that comes and blows everything out on the camp, knocks everything down. And so we got, of course, our scanning department to go and scan the whole camp and get a post, a pre-destruction. And then, of course, the tsunami goes and takes that whole camp out.
That was probably by far the largest fluid shot like that we'd attempted at the studio, and the schedule for this at that point in the season was not super favorable, so we knew we'd have to get it right on the first or second try. So it was also almost 500 frames, and as I said, we're going from way in the distance to right up close, so that's like all the recipes to make it a challenging shot. So the first thing we had to do is block it out, and some of that was with proxy surfaces and layout, where we're trying to come up with a speed that made sense. And then we had to get in there and start running some sims to make sure that the speed would feel realistic. So for the hero sim, there were a huge amount of elements that went into it. So the core of it was probably a half dozen high-res flip sims, which is a type of fluid sims at the core. For each one of those, there were secondary sims, which were whitewater, foam, and spray. There were some little custom mist and volume sims we set up to sort of add to the feeling of scale we needed. We needed it to feel like it was getting crystallized into there and really kind of mucking up the whole area. We did separate sims for the lake interaction and for the dirt interaction on the sides. You'll notice if you look really closely, the water that goes over the lake has a different feel to the water that goes over the dirt in terms of what gets chewed up along the ground. And then eventually it runs into the colony structures. So for those guys, we ended up doing an RBD sim for those ones, and in points we set up some constraints and did a little bit of hand tweaking to make sure it was doing what we wanted it to do. I ended up running the sim in several stages, so we did a lower res sim to push those objects in the camp around, and then add a little bit of keyframing on top of it, and then we reran it with the hero sims. In a perfect world, it would have been great to run everything at a final res together, but it just wouldn't have been practical, and there would have been too much randomness in there. We might have ended up with a container going right through the camera, or doing something really goofy. So I think the way we did it in the end made a lot of sense, and I think it still feels like they're connected because the collisions ended up being live in the end, and it we were all pretty happy with it at the end. Just to note, the amount of geometry we ended up within the end of the shot was just insane. Like, it was multiple terabytes of data for the shot. We had to mesh our fluid in a method with clusters and levels of detail just to make sure that it was all renderable. And in the end, if I recall, we split it up into 3 different render passes. So we had our ground stuff, we had our fluid, and then we had all our mist and volume elements. And we did those all as deep renders and sent it to comp and crossed our fingers, and it turned out pretty cool.
So now we're going to jump into season 5. And actually, this is the very first time our team has ever done a public event where we've talked about our work on season 5. So that's really exciting. Everybody watching, this is a big first. So getting into some of the details there, we have the asteroids traveling through space. And that was such a key scene. It sort of sets the stakes for the whole season. What were some of the challenges that you faced when designing the performance of the asteroids? And how did the creative direction support the science behind such an intricate sequence? Bert, I'm hoping you could speak to that.
Yeah, so so obviously with Expanse, they want authenticity and the impact of the asteroids. I think everybody knows about like Chicxulub, which is thought to have caused the dinosaur extinction. And but in terms of actually seeing asteroids impacting the atmosphere and impacting the Earth, our best reference is there's the Chelyabinsk, Russia asteroid, which was all over YouTube with the bright flash that came through the sky, still didn't impact the Earth. And so I think what we needed to do was do a lot of research to figure out what happens during an impact. And so you have like the initial radiation that cooks the air and bakes the clouds away. It's like turning on a convection oven. It's a different type of, it's not heat emanating out. It's just all of the air at once cooking, essentially. And then you have a series of events that occur. So you have like the seismic wave that goes through. You have this ejecta, which is all of the excavation of the material from the impact coming out. You have molten ejecta coming out the top. You have this interesting thing called the ballistic plume, where the asteroid, as it tunneled through the atmosphere, creates a vacuum such that plasma gets sucked back up that vacuum once the impact occurs. And you have the air blast that comes through kind of as the last phase, kind of cleanup essentially. And Expanse was very much interested in modeling all these different features so that they had a really authentic quality to the impacts. We had the scene where the man gets cooked, essentially. His skin starts to melt. We had to do some development on how we wanted to achieve that. And then we had all of the clouds blowing out behind him. And so getting all that timing down with an asteroid that's traveling at 20 kilometers a second and impacting the Earth, and is happening 20 kilometers from this impact, we needed to kind of back time all of that stuff so that we could figure out throughout the progression of that sequence where all these events would be. And so we created a little animatic for Tim and his team to basically execute the whole sequence too. So rather than executing each shot and not having it feel authentic, we created it for the whole sequence and then went from there.
What Bert did was invaluable for us. He's somewhat of an expert in asteroid impacts now, and he basically did all the hard work for us, blocking everything in. So the timing part of it was figured out. We didn't have to waste too much time running our high-res sims and rejigging things. He had figured that part of it out. So we did kind of the back main impact and kind of the crown of ejecta to coming out. We did a pyroclastic wave, which was racing a camera. That was probably the most intense element because it was covering so much ground. We did cheat the speed a little bit close to camera just to make it read better. But for the most part, it was pretty true to the timing. That was a clustered pyro sim in Houdini, so we were able to squeeze a whole lot of detail into there. And then the foreground, I think, is really what makes the shot. So we're playing with some of the stuff in the plate where we had the sign dangling from the chain and reacting in the wind. We replaced some of the onset material there. We had these two little containers flying forward. And then we added in some fine scale spray particles, and there was even a little bit of sand and sparks in there. And that stuff really added to the sense of speed because that stuff was just whipping by the camera lens at the end. So it was cool to have a shot that was layered in so many depth elements. So you got to look way back to the horizon, and then literally 25 frames later, you've got stuff rushing over the camera. So yeah, no, that was a fun one.
The thing is that these things occur for a given reason. Like the behavior that they exhibit has to have a physicality to it. It has to have a tie to some rationale or logic. And I think where you get in trouble in visual effects, and I think Expanse is wise to avoid this, is when you don't consider the natural factors that are occurring there, why a certain thing looks the way it does, what's actually happening there. So I think digging in and really understanding the sequence of events, how they layer and how they kind of each affects the next. I think that's important to create kind of a cohesive, believable event.
The Lunar Shuttle takeoff that occurs in season 5 is a very stylized scene. And Mark, how were you able to accomplish the interactive lighting on the practical trees with the CG support and as well on the clouds as the shuttle passes through? I mean, that's a great example of the mixture of practical and digital.
For an asset build, we had to start with just the tracking geo that was created to just kind of know our orientation and where we could build these trees that we need for this effect. And once we kind of established that this is our playing field and we had our lunar shuttle base integrated into the ground, and I think we even kind of sculpted some snow in there to kind of blend it in. The trees were really just constructed just using speed tree. And once we figured out the species of trees that might be around this house just by the plate, we just use that software to create that foliage, and it's really, really quick. It's fast to do iterations of all different types of trees. So very quickly, we're able to populate foliage around this house for this effect to react to. And once we had that set dressed and the shuttle doors opened, and on that wide shot from up above, there was just a lot of elements in there that we could play with. Not just the trees, but even the clouds up above, which I believe Tim had done VDB builds for that, and just the evening and the evening sky and the contrast against like the snowy surroundings. All that just added a really great drama to that shot. So once the trees are in there, I mean, you're naturally going to get that interactive lighting. The plumes of the blast from the ignition is going to go all through the forest. Once that rocket blasts off, you get that cool piercing through the clouds and all that light kind of spreading across the cloud layers. And there was just a lot of different elements in there that Comp could play with. So yeah, it was a fun shot.
As always, the Expanse is really well prepared for this sort of thing, and they choreograph it as well as they can so that it makes our jobs easier. They had planned for when the shuttle leaves the hangar, breaks through the glass, that the flames would light up the foreground trees, as well as the flames from the shuttle would shoot down this corridor that's about I'd say like 50 or 60 yards down towards the house, and then out of the garage, where the flames would come out of the garage and light the background trees. So when we were comping it, we were able to separate the foreground and background so that we can then offset the timing when as we need it. So if we find that it's not working well in time when the shuttle is coming out, then we can just offset the background trees to work with our lighting. They always pre-plan it, and they do a really good job of their on-set preparations for us. And I think it just goes to show it was how well it was orchestrated for us to do such a good job.
One thing we didn't know when we started that sequence was how fast that shuttle was going to be exiting that hangar. And so we had to kind of flesh out the animation over the course of the shots so that because we had a continuous series of moves of this thing going through, and we wanted to match that velocity, which required in a shot like that where we have interactive light they filmed on set, we have to retime that plate and extend the move because they're not tilting the camera up. We had to create that move, create a little nodal pan up, and retime the different elements so that they would occur at the right time.
And Tim, how do you approach shots like these that require such an extreme close-up of the simulation? Is that handled the same way, or do you have a different process for handling effects that come that close to camera?
Yeah, it's all about attention to detail and then just making sure that it's technically feasible to pull off, and it's not going to melt down our farm and be unrenderable. So for the shot where it comes out of the ground, we started off with actually a nice little setup where we had it breaking through the glass, and we had the metal girders bending and the glass shattering. Now in the end, you can't really see that, but it's buried in there somewhere if you look really closely. And that was our first step, and then after that we had to populate it with the fire sims, which was really the most challenging part of it, just because we are so close, and again, it's coming right up to the camera, and in those cases you have to plan for the closest part where the detail is going to have to hold up the best, so you really can't cheat anything there. One cheat I did do in that setup was we had a foreground and a background container basically of our pyro simulation. Because of the perspective of the camera, it was very forgiving there, so we could in effect double the amount of resolution we could put into there and still get away with it. And then for our shot where we see the rocket breaking off further up through the clouds, that was done with the new sparse pyro solver in Houdini, which basically lets you do a container on the fly. So for long, thin shapes that that don't neatly conform to a cube or that are going diagonally. That lets you populate sort of on-the-fly voxels as it goes through the sim, which is kind of a game changer for nerds like us. So that helped quite a bit.
And Masa, in order to accomplish a realistic lunar shuttle, lighting needed to match exactly to the timing of flares that were set off and used on set to illuminate the environment. How do you approach improving the lighting of the scene, matching the practical lights on the CG elements?
Step number one is that the CG elements have to sit correctly into the shot that is already shot, and all the practical lights and the environmental lights. So that's the step number one. The lighting artists basically light the spaceship and the hangar to match exactly and sit exactly into that shot. And then after that, all the new fire elements, when the spaceship takes off, those fire elements, then they become the lights themselves that they are going to light the spaceship and the environment on top of what was already shot.
It's worth noting on that takeoff shot that was a day for night that we were then thinking about removing. I can't remember if we actually ended up doing this. We were going to remove the shadows from the practical sun and have moving shadows from the rocket taking off. So we're basically doing a clean plate of the day shot, converting it to a night, and then putting in the traveling shadows, which is kind of an interesting aspect of that shot.
How has it felt to see the fan reactions to the show and where the story has taken us so far?
Okay, it feels really great to read the comments that some of the fans are putting on social media, because I get a real sense of loyalty to the books from their end. So if they can connect it to what they've imagined when they're reading the books to the pictures that we're putting out there for them to see on the screen, then, and if they like it, then that's a good sign. And it just shows that we're doing something right from the top of, from the producers to concept artists, all the way down to the artists, the VFX team. It's really great to be a part of that whole process. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the VFX team at the Expanse, from the VFX supervisors, Brett Culp and Robert Crowther, to the supervising producer, Lewin Webb, and the VFX producers, Krista Elaine and Sarah Wormsbecker.
And thanks to Bob Monroe for entrusting Spin with that work and for bringing the show to us in that first few seasons, because his leadership and direction was invaluable in the process.
So with that, we are going to conclude our panel today. First and foremost, I want to thank our panelists for those amazing answers and for, no pun intended, illuminating so much of the show that we love so much and that we've been with for so long. I'd also like to thank SparkFX for hosting this panel. This has been a lot of fun. And thank you as well to the viewers for tuning in. If you liked what you heard today, I'd like to let you know that we actually have two other panels. One is going to be about our visual effects work on the Netflix original series, The Umbrella Academy, which is another show that we have had the privilege of being with since its inception in season 1 and we will be with in season 3. And we also have a panel coming up about AR, VR, which is going to be hosted by our sister company, SpinVR, and a demo will be shown in that one from our creative director, Dave Cardwell, who's going to be able to talk to you if you're interested as an artist yourself in getting into the AR, VR space and what tools are available to you there. Finally, you can always check us out and learn what SpinVFX is up to on our social media platforms, and that we're on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And of course, you can always check us out at www.spinvfx.com. You can check out all of our visual effects breakdown reels, including work we've done on shows like Game of Thrones, Stranger Things, and more. And you can also see what we've got coming up. Some of the cool projects that we're working on right now include, as I've already said, Umbrella Academy Season 3, the 6th season of The Expanse, and a film we have coming out pretty soon is Chaos Walking, so look out for that. And always keep up with us, always send us a message if you've got questions. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, we are thrilled to be able to premiere the newest visual effects breakdown reel featuring never-before-seen breakdowns of our visual effects work on Season 5. So here it is, the SpinVFX VFX breakdown reel for the hit Amazon series, The Expanse.